Boldwood presents The Scandalous Love of a Duke, written by Jane Lark and read by Sophie Warner. Chapter 1. Katherine's fingers grasped the pale, uneven trunk of the beech tree. Laughing, she braced her body to stop her descent down the grassy slope, her fingers slipping on the thin strips of peeling bark. She turned back to catch her friend's hand. In fits of giggles, Margaret fell against the tree too. "Shh," Eleanor, Margaret's younger cousin, whispered, her fingers pressed to her lips as she struggled to tame her own intemperate humour. "They will hear us." More giggles erupted from the large group of younger girls behind them. Eleanor was the most boisterous of them, though. Looking across her shoulder, Katherine smiled. Katherine was the outsider here, the odd one out, a Spencer. All the other girls were the Duke of Pembroke's grandchildren. Katherine was nothing compared to them. Her adopted father was a lowly squire. But Katherine had grown up among this family. These girls were more sisterly to her than her sister. Her brother Philip was John Harding's friend, and John was another of the Duke's grandchildren, the eldest and his grandfather's heir. One day, John would own the land they stood on, and a dozen other estates. He would be rich. John. His name stilled Katherine's heart and slowed her breathing as a secret longing welled inside her. "Can you see them?" Caroline, one of Margaret's younger sisters, whispered. "What are they doing?" Margaret leaned forward, peering over Katherine's shoulder. "Swimming," Eleanor managed to gasp and giggle at the same time. "They are naked." The girls about Katherine broke into fits of laughter again. "Hush!" Heather, Margaret's older sister, who was the eldest of the girls, urged them to be silent. She was 8 and 10. She had already curtsied to the Queen. Her father was an heir to a duke, too. All the other girls were the daughters of dukes or earls. Katherine loved them all, but even so she knew she stood out. "We should not have followed," Heather said. "Papa will kill me," Eleanor laughed. "And Grandfather will kill John," Margaret whispered. The girls looked at one another as Katherine looked about them all. John was their pattern card. All his younger cousins followed him like shadows, emulating everything he did. They were all in awe of him. But Katherine's feelings were much more than just awe. She loved John, secretly, but without hope or expectation. When she was with him, her heart ached and raced, and, well, she did not know how to explain it. Katherine's gaze focused on the boys cavorting in the lake. They seemed oblivious to the girls obscured by the curtain of leaves. They were splashing water at each other, shouting and baiting one another, laughing. John, pale-skinned, lean and athletic, lunged at Katherine's brother, gripped his shoulders and pushed him under water. The game grew more aggressive. Philip thrust up and retaliated, lunging back at John, and when John dodged him, Philip dived beneath the water and pulled him under. All the boys, a dozen or more of John's friends from Oxford, broke into an uproar then, as the game became a melee. They were not boys, though, not anymore, no more than she was a girl. They were young men, and she was on the brink of womanhood. She could be married now if she wished. The problem was, the only person she wished to marry was unattainable John. "We should go," Heather breathed beside her. "We shouldn't be here." Katherine turned. Eleanor made a mischievous face at her older cousin. "Killjoy, give them their privacy," Heather pressed. Eleanor pouted. She was only 13. "We didn't know they were going to swim, and that is precisely why we should go back before we are missed." Heather caught hold of Eleanor's arm. "Come on, they will start the celebrations soon." The other girls began peeling away. Katherine would have to go back too, but she would rather be in the water. Her gaze returned to the lake. The day was hot, and the heat was heavy, clinging and depressive. "Kate!" Eleanor called, in an "Are you coming" voice. Katherine glanced back and nodded, before taking an irresistible final look at the boys. John was standing in the shallow water, near where the lake dropped over a weir, into a cascade, taunting her brother. The lake rose to the indent of muscle at his hip. Katherine's breath was trapped in her lungs for a moment. He had lost the coltish look he had a few years ago when she first met him. He was physically magnificent now, over 6 feet tall, sinuous and muscular. She longed to touch him, and her heartbeat raced like the thudding hooves of a galloping horse as warmth flooded her veins. "Kate!" Eleanor called again. John's head turned, and his intense ice-blue eyes spun in the direction of the trees where she was hiding. There was an aura about John, an attraction which drew everyone in. His looks were striking, and he had a presence which captured people's attention when he was in a room. He was born to lead people, or perhaps bred to do so. His fingers lifted and swept his damp jet-black hair off his brow, but his gaze didn't leave the trees. He had an inherent grace, too. He was calm and silent in nature, though strong-willed. He won most arguments with her brother. But he had an instinctive awareness of others, and he was always kind to her. John acted like a brother to her. He was always considerate. He included her even when Philip forgot to, and John never grew tired of her dogged company, as Philip sometimes did. At what point her feelings had changed from sisterly to something else, she could not say. Perhaps she had always felt differently about John, but now it was obsession. His eyes seemed to find hers, though surely he could not see her. She smiled. All the girls in his family were stunningly beautiful. It carried from their mothers. In John, that beauty was breathtakingly masculine. She could not take her eyes off him when she was near him. "John!" her brother called. John's gaze ripped away, his awareness disengaging from the trees and returning to the lake. "Kate!" Katherine caught her breath, dragging air into her lungs, and turned back. Eleanor and the others were at the top of the slope waiting for her. Katherine lifted her hand to say she was coming and began to climb. Chapter 2. Egypt, December, 7 years later. John let the handle of the spade rest against his midriff, set one hand on his lean waist, and wiped his brow with his forearm. Then he lifted the wide-brimmed leather hat from his head and tipped his gaze to the endlessly clear blue sky. God, it was hot here, but it was the middle of a bloody desert. "The skin, please." He looked at one of the native men in his train. Almost instantly, the water skin was in John's hand. The warm water slid down his throat, relieving the dryness. They'd found a new tomb, but it was buried beneath centuries of sand. Dropping his hat back on his head, John bent and resumed digging. His blade slipped easily into the sand, but half of each shovel load slid back into the hole. He cursed and increased his pace. "My lord, I have it," Yasser, the man who'd been John's right hand for years, called. John let his spade fall and moved to where Yasser worked, dropping to his knees to scoop out sand with his bare hands. "It is the entrance." There was a flare of excitement in John's chest. The hours of hunting and digging were worth it for this moment of success. Before Egypt, John had drifted, despondent. This was why he had come, and this was why he had stayed. "It is open, robbed," Yasser stated. He was on his knees too. Empty, damn. But there would still be the paintings. John leaned back, resting his buttocks on his heels. "Hand me the spade, let us clear it." Later, John sat beneath the canopy before his tent, in a canvas chair, his feet resting on the sand. The sky was red, and the sun glowed on the horizon about to fall. Then suddenly, it literally dropped over the edge of the world, leaving only the blue-black darkness and a million glinting stars, the stars he had seen painted on the ceiling of every temple. The sun never set like this in England, like a scarab beetle had run off with it. That was the ancient Egyptians' explanation for the sun that descended in a rush. He drew on the tip of a thin cigar, letting his hand fall when he exhaled. The tomb they discovered today had been an official's. It was empty, but it was not treasure which excited John anyway. It was the emotion of the search and the find. John took another draw on his cigar. He was in a thoughtful mood, brooding. The images from his hated recurring dream crowding into his head. It had come to him again last night, and it always made him feel melancholy. His gaze reached up to the darkness and the stars. The black of night was like gleaming, polished jet here, not the dull pitch it was at home. When his grandfather had packed John off on the grand tour to sow his wild oats abroad, the intention had been for John to return, with his youthful, dissipated fire burned out, but nothing in England drew John back. He was a child in the dream, looking through the window of his grandfather's grand black coach. He saw his mother, with her dress clutched in one hand, as she ran behind them, reaching towards him. His stepfather was there too, behind her, his skin flushed red, his expression one of fury. But it wasn't only a dream. It was a memory John had never asked to be explained, a memory he had never told any of those who were there that he had. His grandfather had taken him from them. John had never understood why. His childhood had been lonely before that. Perhaps that was why he felt so comfortable in a desert. He had been returned to his mother a few weeks later, but that memory, which his head constantly echoed in a dream, was the defining moment of his life, the point he had been torn in two by his grandfather's will and his mother's love. One was hard, cold, and aggressive, the other warm, welcoming, and enchanting. The second had been a childish pleasure. He had outgrown it. What abided in him now was the barren land his grandfather had cultivated. Before that moment, he had not been allowed to speak of his mother, and never been told why. John's earliest memory was of his grandfather saying he had no mother, she was dead, which John knew was a lie, even at the time. She had visited him at boarding school and written to him for years, and then she had come and taken him away, in the middle of the night. She had run away with him. His memory, his dream, was of the moment his grandfather had found them and taken him back. She had taught him kindness and consideration, empathy and understanding, while his grandfather had encouraged the constant restraint of emotions and harsh judgment of others. Now, John felt constantly angry. This was the reason he'd stayed abroad. He was his grandfather's monster. The years spent in Europe had taught John that. He took another drag on his cigar, then exhaled. When he had arrived in Paris, he had been his mother's child, naive and foolish, the proverbial lamb to be slaughtered, obvious prey for the she-wolves hunting those grounds. He had been seduced by their world and fleeced. It had taken months to learn the art of disengagement. That experience had left him bitter, and his grandfather had achieved his wish. John did not trust a soul. The choice he had made after that was the only one open to him, not to go back. Not going back was the only way he could win the battle against his grandfather. Then he found Egypt, and a purpose, something beyond himself, something which made him feel emotions. The only problem was this loneliness at night. When it was dark, the isolation became stark, and these childhood memories flooded in. In his youth, he had covered them with friendships. In his dissipated years, he had smothered them with sex. He had nothing to do with women since he arrived in Egypt, so there was no hiding from thoughts here. He thought of his stepfather, half-brothers, and sisters. It was Christmas in 4 days. His family would be together, he alone. Occasionally, he wrote home to tell them he was still alive. He took another drag on his cigar, clearing his thoughts. He did not wish to think of his family or England. His thoughts turned to the tomb he had found today and what he would do tomorrow to learn more about whoever had been buried there. A brush in his hand, John lay on his stomach, cautiously sweeping sand away from the painted wall plaster of the tomb they'd discovered 4 days earlier. The colours were so bright they could have been painted days ago.
"My lord."
John looked across his shoulder. Mustafa, his manservant, who usually stayed in camp, was looking through the couple of feet wide hole John and others had dug through from the entrance.
"My lord, this letter came from England."
Mustafa waved the thin paper as though it was something wonderful. John glanced at his chief excavator.
"Yes, sir. Would you carry on without me?"
He shuffled backwards out of the tomb into the blazing midday sun. As he stood, he brushed the sand from his clothes, then took the letter. It had a mark showing it passed through Alexandra a month ago. He recognized the writing as his stepfather's. In England, his family would be on his stepfather's small estate today, celebrating Christmas. On occasions, he had spent Christmas with them. Most often, he'd been forced to spend it with his grandfather. Either way, Christmas did not bring forward many fond memories. John broke the red wax seal that had held the letter closed on its long journey. His grandfather would be horrified if he saw the calluses on John's hands. Glancing up, John thanked Mustafa and then began walking towards the canopy his men used at prayer times. He stopped in its shade and opened the letter. A second separate folded sheet fell out. He held that aside and read. The letter was dated August, months ago. "Dear John, I have grave news regarding your grandfather." John read the letter, stiff with shock. His father's words were carefully couched, but the meaning was clear. The Duke of Pembroke was dying. He could be dead by now, John thought, his hand covering his mouth. His lips were dry, and the sun beat down on his back, but inside he felt like ice. His hand swept back his hair. This meant he had to go back. He had been bred to take over his grandfather's title and estates. The choice was no longer his. It struck him he should be feeling grief, sadness. He did not. He had never cared for the old tyrant. But he did feel strangely suspended, as though time had stopped, as though it would never start again. He did not want to go back. John looked at the other letter and saw Mary's effervescent writing. Mary was his eldest sister, the first child of his mother's second marriage. She was just 16, approaching her first season in London high society. She had clearly written in a hurry, scribbling a note to include in her father's letter. She told John she needed her big brother home, to lead her in her first waltz. She vowed she wouldn't dance a single one unless he came. Their grandfather's death would postpone her debut. She obviously did not know he was ill, or the Duke had not been at death's door when this was written. Whatever the situation, John would not shy from his responsibility. He had to go back.
"Mustafa!"
John turned. Chapter 3. London, England. April. 4 months later. John's ship docked in London just as twilight darkened into night. A light drizzle was falling as he descended the gangplank. It felt odd stepping onto the dock, like travelling back in time. It was over 7 years since he had stood on English ground. He remembered the callow youth who left here, the boyish fool. One of the ship's crew had waved across a hackney carriage for his use. It waited on the cobbled dock before him, its oil lamp glowing into the now full darkness. He gave the address to the driver, then climbed in. A few moments after he had clicked the brass lock shut, the carriage jarred into movement, rocking over the uneven cobbles. He had not sent word ahead. There had seemed little point when he would arrive just as fast as any messenger. He lifted the curtain and looked at the passing streets. They had left the narrow back streets of the slums near the docks, and now they were progressing into the more affluent areas of London. The months of his journey had given him time to become used to the idea of coming home. He had accepted this, but it did not mean he was looking forward to it. He would be weighed down by duty here. He did not know if his family were in London. He was heading for his grandfather's townhouse because it seemed the logical place to start. His heart drummed steadily in his chest as he travelled closer to the Duke of Pembroke's townhouse. Was his grandfather alive? The streets were quiet, virtually empty. Early evening in Mayfair was not a social hour. People would be dining now before they went out. All John could hear was the sound of the carriage horses and iron-rimmed wheels on cobble. A few minutes later, the hired carriage drew to a halt, and John looked from the window at his grandfather's palatial town residence. It was set back from the road and guarded by iron railings, taking up one entire side of the square. John had found it oppressive as a child. As a youth, he had been impressed. As a man, it simply seemed ostentatious. John climbed out onto the pavement. He had left his luggage at the docks to be sent on. He paid the driver. The man tipped his hat. John looked up at the house as the hackney pulled away. The knocker was in place. Someone was home. He took a deep breath and then jogged up the pale stone steps. When he reached the top, he lifted the lion-head brass knocker and struck it down thrice, then stepped back and waited. It was several moments before the door opened. Finch, the man who had been his grandfather's butler for as long as John could remember, stood in the hall, guarding the entrance. John watched recognition and then shock dawn on the butler's face. He had never seen Finch's upper lip show any expression before.
Good Lord, come in, my lord. You were not expected. No, I travelled at the same speed as any message. I saw no point in sending word. My luggage will follow. Tell me who is currently at home. He already knew his grandfather had survived. Otherwise, Finch would have addressed him as Your Grace. Their Graces, the Duke and Duchess, my lord, and the Duke and Duchess of Arundel.
His grandparents, then, and his uncle and aunt. John's heart pounded. Finch nodded to a footman, obviously sending him somewhere to announce John's arrival. Suddenly, there was a shout from above.
John!
He looked up as his name echoed off the black and white marble beneath his feet, and in the decorative marble and plaster all about him, and he saw his Uncle Richard, the Duke of Arundel, descending the wide curving stone steps briskly. This man had been like a father to John before John's mother had come into his life, but he had aged. His hair was peppered with grey, and his face more lined.
Thank God! We had no idea if you'd even received Edward's letter.
John saw relief in his uncle's eyes as he neared, and then he smiled.
It is good to have you home, John.
John met Richard at the bottom of the stairs and took his hand to shake it, but Richard also gripped John's shoulder. An uncomfortable feeling tingled through John's nerves. He was unused to being touched. No one had held him in 4 years.
You have changed, John. Grown up, I suppose.
Uncle, John began, only to have his speech halted by a wave of his uncle's hand.
No, uncle, just Richard, now we are both men.
John smiled.
Richard, it is good to see a familiar face. The journey was long and I have no idea of how things stand. How is the Duke? Things stand not well, John.
Richard slung an arm about John's shoulders and drew him to the stairs.
I will take you up. Your grandmother and aunt will be pleased to see you.
And my grandfather? John asked.
Will also be pleased. You have arrived in time, but he is near the end.
Richard's arm fell away from John's shoulders as they began climbing the stairs.
I think he has been holding on for your return. He will want to speak to you at once. I will tell him you are here. He is much changed, John. He has been ill for many months.
John nodded sharply, angry at the emptiness in his chest and the anxiety stirring his stomach. For God's sake, I am a man full grown now. I need not fear him.
Why not wait with your grandmother and Penny? They will be overjoyed you are here. I will come and fetch you."
His uncle must have sensed John's inner turmoil. John felt like the child who had left, the child his uncle had always seemed to pity. He nodded, though, and walked on along the familiar hall as Richard turned the other way. John's head was suddenly full of pictures from the past, the most acute being the day his mother and stepfather had come here to collect him during that troubled 10th year of his life, the day he had been returned to her a short time after the scene which haunted him. When she had previously taken John from his boarding school, it had been in the middle of the night. John's stepfather had been with her. He had been a stranger to John at the time. They had travelled north for miles. Then she had married that stranger. Not long afterwards, John's grandfather had come to take him back, the moment of his dream. The day his mother had collected John from this house, his grandfather recognised her as John's mother for the first time. No one had told him why. The drawing-room door stood ajar, and the sound of women talking drifted through the gap.
"I have no idea what else to do. He will see no other physician, but he is so obviously in considerable pain, and yet he will not take laudanum,"
John's grandmother was saying in a worried voice. Both she and his Aunt Penny had been like mothers to him until he was 10. He thrust his maudlin, childish thoughts aside and pushed the door wider to enter.
"Grandmamma, Aunt Penny."
Both women stood, exclaiming at the sight of him crossing the room, their eyes wide in shock.
"Grandmother."
He lifted her hand from by her side and kissed the back of her fingers, bowing. When he straightened, he saw her eyes glitter in the candlelight. He hugged her gently and pressed a kiss on her temple before letting her go.
"Oh, John, your grandfather will be glad. I am glad. It is good to have you home. You look well. Your journey was not too difficult?"
"My journey was long and difficult, but that is travelling, and particularly in winter. It is good to see you too, grandmother. You have not aged a day." She smiled. Her tears were from happiness.
"Flatterer. You have an air of mystery about you now, John, and I think it suits you,"
his aunt said. John turned to her, smiled, and opened his arms. She hugged him.
"Ellen must be overjoyed."
She was also crying when he released her.
"I have not seen Mamma yet. I thought it best to come here first. Is she in town?" "Oh, John, yes, she is in town, and she will never forgive me for seeing you first. I shall have Finch send word," his grandmother said. "The whole family are in London,
because of my grandfather's illness.
I shall ask him to contact them all. John."
John turned to see Richard, who stood at the open door.
"His Grace wishes to see you."
A moment later, John was walking back along the statue-lined hall beside his uncle. How long is he likely to live? His uncle glanced sideways.
"It could be hours or days or weeks, John. There is no certainty. He has defied 100 predictions already."
John nodded, feeling his anxiety rise again.
"You have nothing to fear,"
his uncle stated more quietly, as he rested a palm on his shoulder.
John shrugged it off.
He was not that scared child anymore, and if his grandfather was so close to death, he needed to earn respect, not pity.
"I am half his age and in my prime. He is on his deathbed. He can hardly dominate me now."
"I was not challenging you, John," his uncle answered with a smile. "I know you are capable, but I also know how cutting his words can be. Pay no mind to them. I have never done so." John tried to recognize Richard's good intent, but only felt discomfort. He felt emotionally naked and vulnerable, and he did not like it. He had not felt this way for years. Richard knocked on the door of the state bedchamber and waited to be called in. John's heartbeat raced when Richard turned the handle. The red and gold decoration in the room was subdued by the low light. Just 2 candles were burning, one on either side of the bed, casting shadows. The bed's tall canopy towered above them, and long curtains fell to the floor at either side, screening his grandfather from view. But John could hear his laboured breathing, and the chamber had the putrid smell of sickness. His grandfather's valet stood across the room, and another man was beside the bed. The physician?
Your Grace, I have brought John.
Richard moved forward. John followed. The Duke of Pembroke was propped up on pillows, and his head lay back as though he could not lift it. He was extremely thin, a ghost compared to the statuesque giant who had intimidated John as a child. His skin was grey, and his cheeks sunken. His hands, which rested on the red cover, were skeletal. The old man took a breath, which looked painful, and lifted his hand an inch from the bed. He breathed John's name, and then let his hand fall. John passed his uncle and held his grandfather's hand, lifting it. He pressed a kiss upon the bony knuckles.
Your Grace.
My boy.
The words were barely audible as he fought for breath.
John.
John turned to see Richard had brought a chair for him. He sat, still holding his grandfather's hand, and rested an elbow on the bed, leaning forward.
Grandfather, I was sorry to hear your situation.
A condemnatory sound escaped the old man's lips.
Because it meant you must come home, Sale.
The Duke was the only one who called him by his token title, the Marquis of Sale.
Because it meant you were dying, John corrected. I do not relish that, Your Grace. True, I do not hunger for the reins of the dukedom, but nor do I wish to see you gone. You are my grandfather.
It was probably the most honest statement he had ever made to the old man. It was about bloody time he spoke truthfully.
Unlikely, but now you are back. I may go in peace.
And that is equally unlikely.
John smiled as he met his grandfather's gaze. The old man's body may have been weakened, but his direct gaze and the mind behind it were as strong as ever.
Enough of your cheek.
John smiled more broadly.
So, do you wish to know what I've been up to in my absence?
I know. Your mother has read your letters to me.
The Duke's words were cut off by a painful-sounding cough. John rose and pressed a hand on his grandfather's shoulder.
Perhaps I ought not disturb you.
The Duke's fingers lifted from the bed.
Stay,
he breathed. John sat again.
I have waited for you. You must speak to Harvey about business.
I am sure I shall manage, grandfather.
I know you shall.
John smiled again. That was possibly the only compliment this man had ever given him.
I will leave you to it,
Richard said. The Duke's gaze reached across John's shoulder. Then John heard the door open and shut. The Duke's hand moved and touched John's forearm resting on the bed.
But you must promise me one thing. You will not wed beneath you. You must choose a wife to preserve the bloodline.
John felt his face twist in disgust. Even now, even on his deathbed, the old man sought to cast orders and manipulate John's life. With a self-deprecating smile, he nodded. What did he care? It would not matter who he chose.
You swear?
His grandfather pressed on a single breath.
I swear,
John answered, his smile falling. He knew the old man's game, but chose to play.
Now, talk to me of what you have done. I will listen.
John smiled again and leaned back in the chair, folding his arms over his chest and stretching out his legs. He spoke of Europe, of what he made of it, the things he'd seen and done, and he made his stories humorous, and even made the old man express a muted laugh. It ended in another visibly painful coughing fit, at which point the old man's valet stepped forward to plump the pillows and make the Duke more comfortable. John would have left, but his grandfather once more bid him stay. John changed the subject to his true passion, to Egypt, and began talking about the place and people, about the amazing artifacts and architecture of that ancient world. He talked of the finds he was shipping home. While John spoke, the old man smiled and shut his eyes, his chest rising and falling with each rasping breath. It was strange watching him thus, this ogre who had dominated John's life as a man and not a child. His grandfather was just a man too, with human frailty. John felt a heavy sense of regret as he continued recounting a pointless search he had set out upon once. A sound of humour escaped the Duke's lips. If John had returned in better circumstances, he wondered if they had more time, man to man, whether the past could be put straight between them. His grandsire's physician stepped forward a while later, advising his Grace to rest. John rose and laid a hand on his grandfather's shoulder. The old man opened his eyes.
I do not want your pity, Sale.
John laughed. You will not have it, grandfather, but you will have my admiration. He gave a slight bow. Your Grace, I will leave you to recoup. He had never spoken so openly to the old man as a youth. John's hands slid into his pockets as he walked back along the hall, his head full of drifting thoughts. He wondered now if the perceptions he had held as a child would have changed with an adult's view. Possibly, probably, but it was too late to know now. John! Looking up, he saw a slender, strikingly beautiful young woman. She had ebony hair and pale blue eyes like his own. A beam of joy lit her face, and then she caught up her skirt and ran at him. Good God, was this Mary Rose, his sister, all grown up? She hugged him fiercely, her arms about his neck. He held her loosely. John! Oh, John! I am so glad you are back! His baby sister was no longer a child. She had been about 10 years old and not much taller than his midriff when he left. Now she was as tall as his shoulder. He lifted her off her feet and twirled her once, smiling, before pressing a kiss against her temple. Mary, my not-so-little-any-more sister. Her hands closed about his arms, and she leaned back, grinning as she looked him over. You were no different, other than a little older. And more worldly, another female voice came from along the hall. John looked beyond Mary and saw his mother had stepped out from the drawing-room. She was also still strikingly beautiful. Their colouring was hers, but there were now 2 wings of grey in her hair at her temples. His smile softened. Mamma. John. She swept towards him as Mary moved aside, and she was in his arms in a moment and pressed a kiss on his cheek. You have been away too long. I have missed you. There were tears shining in her eyes. I missed you too, Mamma. Liar, she whispered, before she drew away, low enough so Mary could not hear. It was not a malicious word, just the truth, and they both knew she was right. One fingertip tapping her beneath the chin, he made a face. I am home now, anyway. And I am glad. Come and meet everyone else. She slipped her arm through his, linking him to her with an elbow as she turned towards the drawing-room. Mary occupied his other arm, and both women questioned him eagerly as they walked. He felt very strange and disorientated to be so besieged. When they reached the drawing-room, though, all hell broke loose. He was mobbed by his various aunts and elder female cousins. Once they finally pulled away, hankies in their hands, John was then greeted by the men, his uncles by marriage first, and then his male cousins. His stepfather, Edward, held back.
When the pandemonium ceased, John looked at his stepfather. He stood across the room with a youth beside him. Robbie! John's eldest brother. He looked so like his father it was unmistakable. Robbie must be 15, the age when awkwardness set in. He seemed to deliberately not look at John. That must be why Edward stayed back, torn between welcoming his stepson and supporting his own son. John smiled and approached them. He greeted his brother first. Robbie was already over shoulder height against his father. Robbie. The boy coloured up with palpable self-consciousness. John's smile broadened. Robbie had idolised John as a child, but he had been 8 when John left. The age gap between them was too wide for any real relationship.
John?
Robbie took the hand John had offered and shook it limply, but John used the grip to draw his brother into a brief embrace and patted his shoulder.
You have grown. Would you like me to take you to Tats with me when I look for a carriage and horses?
Yes.
The boy's face lit up, as Mary's had done earlier.
Will you really take me?
If you are sensible.
He lifted a closed fist and pressed it to his brother's jaw in a masculine gesture of affection, but the lad ducked away, laughing.
I am always sensible. You have just not been here to know it, the cocky brat responded.
John laughed.
Perhaps you ought to ask me if he has been good. I think his masters at Eton may have some tales to tell if they were asked, his stepfather interrupted.
John.
His name was spoken with warmth and layered with hidden emotions. John smiled. Edward's hair was still a dark brown, untainted by age, yet there were more lines about his eyes. He was younger than John's mother.
Father?
With a twinkle in his eye, Edward said, Son, as he held John's shoulders firmly. He had always treated John like his own son, no different to Mary or Robbie or the rest.
I'm glad you are back.
Edward's hands fell away. John was woken by a sharp rap on his bedchamber door. He sat up and threw the sheet aside from where it had lain across his hips.
My lord,
a low voice called.
Yes, what is it?
John was already swinging his legs from the bed and rising.
His Grace, my lord. The physician believes there is not much time. He sent me to fetch you.
I will be there in a moment,
John called, instantly shifting to search for his clothes in the dark room. It felt bizarre to be here. It had felt odd to see his grandfather ill, and now it was like a dream, not a nightmare, though. He only felt emptiness inside, not sadness nor fear. His eyes adjusting to the dark, he found his trousers and slid them on. He pulled his shirt over his head. He had said good night to his grandfather, as had the others before they left, one by one, and he had wondered then how long. Hours was the answer. He sat and pulled on his stockings and shoes, then his shirt. When John left his room, the hall was morbidly silent. John gently knocked on the door of his grandfather's chambers.
It is the Marquis of Sale.
The door opened, and a footman bowed.
My lord.
His grandmother sat in the chair John had occupied earlier, her hand resting over his grandfather's. She looked across her shoulder at John.
John.
Her voice was heavy with emotion. Though he knew their marriage had never been a love match, for her it had been more like endurance. John stood behind her and laid his hands on her shoulders. There were 3 footmen in the room, his grandfather's valet and the physician.
His Grace's heartbeat is very weak, the physician said quietly. He is unconscious.
John nodded, his gaze falling to the man who had always been a significant figure in his life. Even during the years he had hidden from the Duke's influence abroad, he had still been the Duke's heir. He was never able to escape that. The old man was barely breathing, weak and wraith-like. John took a deep breath, stepped about his grandmother, leaned forward and rested a hand on his grandfather's shoulder, then pressed a kiss on his cold brow.
Goodbye. I never thought I would miss you, but I shall, John whispered, before rising. There was no sign that the Duke had heard him, yet John felt better for having said the words. They were true. The Duke of Pembroke took his last breath as John stood with his grandmother. John's grandmother rose and leaned to kiss the Duke's cheek, tears slipping from her eyes. John felt only emptiness, oddness, a lacking. The physician walked past them both and lifted John's grandfather's wrist, checking for a pulse. Then he bent and listened for breath before finally rising and drawing the sheet up and over the old man's face. John's grandmother turned sharply, and John opened his arms to her. While he held her, the men about the room bowed, and his grandfather's valet said, "Your Grace." John felt the floorboards shift sideways beneath his feet. He had known this day would come, but it was strange, now it was here. I am the Duke of Pembroke. This house, everything in it, and several more like it, acres and acres of land, and the tenants living and working upon that land, were all his responsibility now. Chapter 4. Standing on the lea beside Westminster Abbey, Katherine watched as the procession neared. The coffin was displayed in a black hearse, pulled by 6 jet horses, with black-dyed ostrich feathers bobbing on their heads, as they trotted with high, precise steps. Their manes and tails were plaited and tied with black ribbon. Gripping her reticule with both hands and holding it more tightly, Katherine took a deep breath. Her heart was pounding. As the hearse drew to a halt, she lifted to her toes to see over the crowd. It seemed as if half of London was in attendance to view the pomp and ceremony of the old Duke of Pembroke's funeral. All she could see of John, as he climbed from his open carriage behind the hearse, was his head and shoulders. Her heart ached. She watched him move alongside his uncle's to release and lift the coffin. A rush of pain and longing spilled from her heart into her limbs. It had been so long since she had seen him, but her reaction was the same as it had been more than half a dozen years before. The rhythm of her heart rang like an ironmonger's hammer against her ribs. Her brother, Philip, braced her elbow to stop her being knocked off balance by the crowd. He could have gone into the abbey, but women were not to attend funerals, and he had promised to stay with her. Katherine's heartbeat thumped even harder as John and his uncles passed them. The crowd surged forward then, as people moved in a crush to enter the abbey and stand at the back. Katherine waited outside with Philip, acutely aware of the chasm between her life and John's. Even so, she had jumped at the chance to see him when Philip had said he was going to come to the funeral. Their father had read of the old Duke's death and John's return in the paper only days ago. She could hardly believe John had finally come back. She was still hopelessly in love with him, or rather with her dreams of him. She could hardly claim to know him now. She had not seen him in years. When his family filed back out of the abbey, she could see John at the front. He looked different. He had matured. He had travelled the world and seen things she would never see, experienced things she could never imagine, and now he was a duke. She was a provincial nobody compared to him. She was here to mourn, not for the loss of the former duke, but for the loss of any hope. Her feelings would never be reciprocated. She would never have John. It had been a childish dream she could not shake off. She had always known who he was and what he was. He walked past them. The crowd was 3 or 4 people deep in front of her, but she briefly had a clear view of his head and shoulders. He still looked breathtakingly handsome, with his pitch-black hair and pale, crystalline gaze, and there was an eye-catching strength in his sculpted features. Behind her, a dozen female whispers concurred with her view. Katherine dropped her head and hid beneath the brim of her bonnet when John's gaze passed across the crowd.
Not that he would remember her, or even care that she was here. Philip's fingertips squeezed her arm, holding her steady as men came out from the abbey and the crowd shifted. He thought she'd come because John had been a close friend for a number of years, and she wished to support him. It was why Philip was here. She had come only to see John. It was ludicrous of Philip to think John needed their support. John was surrounded by people of his own class. We are fools, the pair of us, harping back to a relationship that no longer exists. This was not the boy, nor the young man who had treated her as an equal. This man was an entirely different beast, influential, dominant and superior, way beyond her. She glanced at Philip. He was watching John's progress with a slight smile on his face, as if he thought John might acknowledge them and smile too. Katherine had no such expectations. When her gaze returned to John, he was climbing up into his carriage, lithe and athletic. Oh God, I love him. I cannot help it, I just do. When she had planned this day with Philip, she had wondered if, perhaps even hoped that, when she saw John she would feel nothing, and discover her feelings had been a girlish infatuation, that it would no longer hurt to think about how out of her reach he was. But she felt as she had 7 years ago. When he was seated, he looked through the carriage window at the crowd, and she sensed a moment of vulnerability in him. She could not justify the feeling. It was just a sixth sense she could not explain. She longed to hold him and tell him all would be well. How absurd. He would probably push her away if she attempted it. Why on earth would he choose plain Katherine Spencer to confide in? Philip's lips brushed her ear as he leaned down to speak over the noise of the crowd.
We will go to John's house for a little while before I run you home.
She looked up. We cannot. We will not be welcome.
We can and we are. We may not be aristocracy, but we are gentry. Come, we will be mingling with half of the House of Lords. I'm not missing a chance like this. Just think about the tales you will be able to tell at your little Sunday school.
Philip, we will be turned away.
We will not. John would never throw us out. He will welcome us, you will see.
Philip smiled. We will look ridiculous if you are wrong, she said, as she let him lead her away. Half an hour later, Katherine rose onto her toes to whisper in her brother's ear, This is folly. A second later, they crossed the threshold of John's opulent townhouse as the butler held the door wide. Her gaze swept the massive hall, with its black and white checkered floor and gilded marble pilasters. The grandness of this house was intimidating, and it belonged to John. The butler bowed, slightly, plainly waiting on their names. He was the gatekeeper, and this was the moment of dignity or humiliation. The hall was crowded. Katherine could barely breathe.
Master Philip Spencer and Miss Katherine Spencer, Philip stated. The butler's eyes widened. Master Spencer, he repeated, looking hard at Philip. Katherine let her breath out. This man remembered Philip. She had forgotten Philip stayed in this house with John during some school breaks. She wished she'd paid more attention to John's life when she was young. She would not have fallen in love if she had realized how different they were. She had been deceived. She had played with him in the grounds of his grandfather's estate as though they were equal, but they were not equal. She had never even been in the house there. Only Philip had been welcome inside the houses, the walls of John's life. Refreshment is being served in the dining room, sir. Where is the Duke, Finch? I cannot say for sure, sir. I believe his Grace is in the state drawing-room, yet I may be wrong. Philip nodded his thanks, and then his grip on Katherine's arm steered her on again. They were absorbed in the crowd of elite society. I told you so. He bent sideward to whisper. As Philip looked for John, Katherine felt her throat dry with a nervous fear. The drawing-room was as ostentatious as the hall. The high ceiling boasted plaques of painted images, scenes of the Greek gods sprawled on clouds and semi-clad.
She had never seen anything so beautiful and so opulent. John should have been easy to spot. He was so tall, but she could not see him. "Where is he?" she asked Philip, who was tall enough to look over people's heads, her heart racing at the prospect of actually speaking to him.
"He is not in here, but the girls are. We will wait. He will come back this way. You can catch up with Margaret and Eleanor."
The pounding of her heart became a deafening rhythm as Philip led her across the room towards John's family. John's eldest sister, Mary Rose, spotted them first. She was dressed in black, as they all were, but unlike many, with her dark hair, pale eyes and skin, even black made her look beautiful. Katherine pinned a smile on her face. She felt more certain of a welcome from the girls, but she did not wish to appear gauche. "I cannot believe it!" Mary exclaimed as they neared. "Philip! Katherine!" Her exclamation drew the attention of the others. Mary had been a young girl when Katherine saw her last. "I have not seen you for an age." Mary hugged Katherine. They had never been friends. Mary had been too young, and yet, as the younger one, she had admired her brother's playmate, with the desire to join their games. Mary had shouted at John as a child over why Kate was allowed to play the boys' games when Mary was not. Now, as a young woman, her exuberance was expressed fondly as Mary held Philip's offered hand. Of course, again, Katherine had forgotten how much better Philip knew John and his family. She had been welcomed into their circle for an hour here or there in the grounds of Pembroke Place. Philip had lived with John in the way of a brother, both at school and during the holidays. Philip gallantly kissed the back of Mary's hand. "John will be beside himself to know you have come. I am sure he did not expect to see you. I shall find him." Lifting to her toes, she looked across the room. "Oh, I cannot see him. I will go and look." "No," Katherine said, as she felt a sudden panic. "Please, do not disturb him. I am sure he has more important people to speak with than us." Mary's pale blue eyes, the image of John's, met Katherine's. "Well, if he has time later, I'm sure he will come over and speak." Katherine gave Mary a grateful smile, then looked at Eleanor and Margaret, who stepped forward. "You are both married. I saw the announcements. Are you happy?" It was probably an impertinent question, but she could think of nothing else to say. They looked at one another, smiled, then they looked beyond Katherine, and Eleanor pointed. "They are together. Across the room, there," Eleanor said. The smile in her eyes said she was happy. Katherine looked across her shoulder. "Harry is the blonde-haired gentleman, my dashing heir to an earl," Eleanor stated. "Is he not handsome? And Margaret's husband, George, is the brown-haired man. He is a little older than Harry." "But distinguished, don't you think?" Margaret interjected. "It is lovely to see you," she said, as Katherine looked back at them. Margaret hugged her, but with more restraint than Mary. Then Eleanor hugged Katherine. "It is wonderful to see you. What do you think of our husbands?" Her fingers touched Katherine's arm. "They are both exceedingly handsome." "We know," Eleanor laughed. "We will introduce you later. Oh, I cannot believe you are here. Now tell us what you have been up to."
"Nothing exciting." "She is being modest," Philip cut in. "She will not sing her own praises. Kate has set up a Sunday school at home for the local children who can neither read nor write." It was hardly comparable. They would not be interested. These were glamorous women who fitted in here. Katherine did not. "I always said you were too virtuous. You are a saint, Kate," Eleanor stated. Katherine felt her colour rise. Hardly. She was false and fragile, and hiding it. "Philip is right," Margaret smiled. "You should not feel embarrassed to admit good deeds." But Katherine did feel embarrassed. "Well, I have good reason to give something back, do I not?" They all, possibly bar Mary, knew of her birth, but perhaps her tone had been a little too blunt, because the conversation dried. Philip's arm came about her,
His hand rested on Catherine's waist, and his fingers gently pulled her closer for a moment. Then he let her go. No one broached the subject of her birth. "I teach the children because I enjoy it," she said to clear the air.
"That is true," Philip stated, "and they adore her, every last one of them."
The conversation slipped into questions and answers as they caught up on the missed years of each other's lives. When John entered the state drawing room, he felt exhausted. The days since his grandfather's death had slipped past in a whirl of activity. First, there had been the wider family to inform and the state acknowledgements to manage. Then the funeral to prepare, and on top of it all, getting to grips with all his grandfather's business affairs. The mantle of a dukedom was lying heavy on his shoulders. He sighed. Richard had said several times this demanding way of life would feel normal eventually. John could not imagine it. Even though the house was straining at the seams with people today, he felt as isolated as he'd been in Egypt and incapable of relaxing. That was not due to the responsibility, though. It was just who he was, like a partridge among peacocks. He had returned to a world of farce. John doubted anyone in the room had really cared for the old duke. At least in Egypt, people, his life, had contained no deceit. A glass of red wine balanced in one hand, the stem dangling between his fingers, John joined another group of guests, acknowledging their presence, fulfilling his duty. But as he spoke, he watched them, wondering why they were here, trusting no one. He sighed out his breath. This was his life now, duty and falsehood. He missed Egypt, the adventure, peace and simplicity. He was already bored of people's endless supplication. He could see beyond their spoken regrets, kind wishes and promises of prayers. They all wanted something from him, either his wealth or his power. His grandfather had warned of this. Now John was seeking his family to escape it for a little while, particularly looking for Mary. He knew his vibrant sister would bring him back from the cold darkness engulfing him. He had passed his mother and Edward in the hall, conversing with Richard and Penny. They had directed him here. His gaze swept about the room, then stopped, not on Mary, but on a young woman standing amid his family, a blonde beacon of light among his dark-haired, black-clad cousins. She wore a pale mauve dress, and her golden hair was styled in a simple chignon. She had the look of an ancient goddess from this angle, with her head slightly turned away from him. Lust gripped hard and firm in his stomach, an intense physical attraction. He had never experienced anything so instant before, but it was years since he had bedded a woman, far too long. Her figure was a sublime balance of curves and narrow waist. Her spine had a beautiful arch as it curved into the point where her dress opened onto a